The year was 1847, and the autumn fog rolled thick across the stone walls of St. Bridget's Chapel like the breath of dying saints. Father Declan O'Malley stood at the altar, his weathered hands trembling as they held the holy book. The candlelight danced against the cold walls, casting shadows that seemed to move with their own purpose. Outside, the village of Ballinakil lay sleeping under a blanket of mist, its chimneys cold, its windows dark. This was the third wedding Father O'Malley had performed in 2 years. The third time he had spoken the sacred words over a bride who stood alone at the altar. The third time he had blessed a union that made his soul feel heavy with questions he dared not ask. Moira Carrowmoor stood before him in a dress that had been her mother's, and her grandmother's before that. The white fabric had turned the color of old bones, and it hung loose on her thin frame. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, showing the sharp lines of her face. Her green eyes stared straight ahead, not at the priest, not at the empty space where a groom should stand, but at something beyond the chapel walls that only she could see. Behind her, in the front pew, sat her younger sister Siobhan. She was barely 16, with the same green eyes and dark hair, but where Moira looked like winter, Siobhan still carried traces of spring. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she watched her sister with an expression that was part love, part fear, and part something else that Father O'Malley could not name. "Do you, Moira Carrowmoor," the priest began, his voice echoing in the empty chapel, "take this man to be your husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Moira's voice was steady when she answered, "I do." But there was no man standing beside her. There never had been. Father O'Malley looked at the empty space and felt his throat close. The wedding registry lay open on the altar, its pages yellow with age. In it, he had written 3 names over the past 2 years. First had been Bridget Carrowmoor, Moira and Siobhan's eldest sister. Then Moira. And next, he knew with a certainty that made his bones ache, would be young Siobhan. The groom's name was always the same, always written in the same careful script. Always the same man who was never there. Thomas Blackwater. Father O'Malley had asked about Thomas once, after Bridget's wedding. He had gone to the Carrowmoor cottage that sat at the edge of the village, surrounded by the dark waters of the bog. The 3 sisters had lived there alone since their parents died in the fever 3 summers past. The cottage was small and gray, with smoke always rising from its chimney and herbs hanging in bundles from its eaves. "Who is Thomas Blackwater?" he had asked Bridget as she served him tea from a pot that was cracked but clean. Bridget had smiled then, and her smile was beautiful and terrible at once. "He is our husband, Father, mine and my sister's. He has been waiting for us for so very long. But where is he?" Father O'Malley had pressed. "Why does he not come to the chapel? Why does he not speak his vows?" "He speaks them," Bridget had said, and her green eyes had grown distant. "Every night he speaks them. We hear his voice through the walls, through the wind, through the water that runs beneath our floor. He calls to us, Father. He has been calling for generations." The priest had left that day with more questions than answers, and he had not returned to the cottage. But he had performed the weddings when asked. What else could he do? The sisters came to Mass every Sunday, kneeling in their pew with heads bowed in prayer. They gave what little they had to the poor box. They tended the graves in the churchyard without being asked. They were good Christian women, even if there was something about them that made the other villagers cross themselves when they passed. Now Moira stood before him, speaking vows to an absent groom, and Father O'Malley felt the weight of his own choices pressing down on him like stones. "You may kiss the bride," he said, though there was no one to kiss her. Moira turned to face the empty space beside her and tilted her head up as if receiving a kiss from invisible lips. She closed her eyes and smiled, and for a moment her face looked peaceful, happy even. Then she opened her eyes and looked at Father O'Malley. "Thank you, Father," she said. "He is very pleased." She signed her name in the registry with a hand that did not shake. The ink seemed to gleam darker than it should in the candlelight. Father O'Malley watched her write, and when she was finished, he saw that there were 4 signatures on the page. Moira's name in her own careful script. and below it, in a hand he did not recognize, the name Thomas Blackwater. The priest's breath caught in his throat. He had not seen anyone else write in the book. He had not seen anyone else approach the altar. But the signature was there, fresh and dark as blood. "Wow," he whispered. Moira looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her 22 years. "He is always with us, Father. Even when you cannot see him, he is here. He has been here since before the chapel was built, since before the village had a name. He waits beneath the bog water and in the spaces between heartbeats. He waits, and we come to him when we are called." She gathered up her skirts and walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Siobhan rose from her pew and followed, but she stopped beside Father O'Malley and looked up at him with young eyes full of knowing. "It will be my turn next year," she said quietly. "When I turn 17. That is when he calls us. That is when we are ready." "Child," Father O'Malley said, and his voice was rough with emotion, "you don't have to do anything you don't want to do. You can leave this place. You can go to Dublin, to Cork, anywhere but here." Siobhan smiled, and her smile was gentler than her sister's had been, but no less certain. "Where would I go, Father? He is in my blood, in my dreams, in the water I drink and the air I breathe. There is nowhere to run for what you are born to be." She followed Moira out of the chapel, leaving Father O'Malley alone with his candles and his questions and the registry that held impossible signatures. He closed the book with hands that shook, and he locked it away in the cabinet behind the altar. But even locked away, he could feel its weight, could feel the presence of names that should not exist written in ink that gleamed like fresh wounds. Outside, the fog had grown thicker, and the village of Ballinakil seemed to disappear entirely into the gray. Father O'Malley extinguished the candles one by one, and with each flame that died, the darkness grew deeper. He walked to the chapel door and looked out into the night, and for a moment he thought he heard something, a voice low and patient, calling from somewhere far away, calling from beneath the black water of the bog, from the spaces between worlds, from a place where love and death were the same thing. The voice knew his name, and it was waiting for him too. By the year 1852, 5 years had passed since Moira's wedding, and 3 since Siobhan had spoken her own vows to the empty air beside the altar. The cottage at the edge of Ballinakil had changed. Where once 3 sisters had lived in quiet solitude, now 12 boys filled the rooms with the sound of breathing, of small feet on wooden floors, of voices that spoke in whispers when they thought no one was listening. The oldest was barely 5, born to Bridget in the winter after her wedding. His name was Cian, and he had his mother's dark hair, but eyes the color of deep water, eyes that seemed to see things that weren't there, or perhaps things that were there but hidden from ordinary sight. The youngest was still nursing at Siobhan's breast, born just 3 months past. His cries were softer than other babies, as if he had been born knowing that loud sounds were dangerous in this house. Father O'Malley walked the muddy path to the cottage every Sunday after Mass, his black robes heavy with rain and his leather bag heavy with communion bread. The villagers no longer asked him why he went there. They had stopped talking about the Carrowmoor women altogether. When the sisters came to market, people turned away. When the boys played in the churchyard after services, other children were called inside. The silence around the family had grown thick as fog and just as cold. The cottage itself seemed to sag under the weight of all those lives. New rooms had been added, built from stones pulled from the bog and wood that grew too straight and too fast. The roof leaked in places, and the walls sometimes wept with moisture that had no source. But it was warm inside, warmer than it should have been, as if something beneath the floorboards was breathing heat up through the cracks. Moira met him at the door, as she always did. She was 27 now, but she looked older. Her red hair had faded to the color of autumn leaves, and lines had appeared around her green eyes. She moved with the careful slowness of someone who carried a great weight, though she was thinner than she had ever been. "Father," she said, and her voice was soft as always. "The boys have been waiting for you." Inside, the cottage was dim despite the afternoon light. Candles burned in every corner, their flames steady and still as if there was no air moving in the rooms. The boys sat in a circle on the floor, youngest to oldest, their hands folded in their laps. They all had the same green eyes, the same copper hair, the same pale skin that seemed to glow in the candlelight. They looked like brothers, which they were, but they also looked like something else. Something that had been carved from the same strange wood, shaped by the same invisible hands. "Children," Father O'Malley said, and his voice caught in his throat as it always did when he saw them all together. "Shall we pray?" They bowed their heads as one, and their silence was deeper than any prayer he had ever heard. The priest opened his bag and brought out the communion bread, breaking it into small pieces. He gave one piece to each boy, watching as they placed the bread on their tongues with a reverence that seemed too old for their young faces. Siobhan emerged from the back room, the baby cradled against her chest. She was 19 now, but motherhood had changed her in ways that went beyond the normal changes of bearing children. Her eyes had grown distant, as if she was always looking at something just beyond the edge of sight. Her movements were graceful but strange, like someone dancing to music only she could hear. "How are you, child?" Father O'Malley asked her, though he was not sure he wanted to hear the answer. "I am well, Father," she said, but her voice had a hollow quality, like an echo in an empty church. "Thomas is pleased with his sons. He speaks of them often." The priest's hands trembled as he put the remaining bread back in his bag. In 5 years, he had never seen Thomas Blackwater. He had never heard his voice or felt his presence. But the evidence of him was everywhere, in the 12 boys who shared his impossible eyes, in the way the cottage had grown to accommodate a family that should not exist, in the signatures that appeared in the wedding registry, written by a hand that belonged to no living man. "Where is Bridget?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. Moira's face grew still. "She is resting, Father." The birth of her last son was difficult. Father O'Malley had not seen Bridget in over a year. The eldest sister had grown stranger with each child, more distant from the world of daylight and ordinary concerns. The last time he had spoken with her, she had told him that Thomas came to her in dreams now, that he showed her visions of places that existed beneath the bog water, cities of stone and shadow, where their sons would one day rule as princes. The boys finished their communion bread and rose to their feet as one. They moved like a single creature with 12 parts, flowing around the room with perfect coordination. The oldest, Kin, approached Father O'Malley and looked up at him with those deep water eyes. "Will you hear my confession, Father?" the boy asked, and his voice was clear as a bell. "You are very young for confession, child," the priest said, but he knelt down to the boy's level. Kian leaned close and whispered in his ear, "I remember the place before I was born, Father. I remember the dark water and the stone rooms beneath the bog. I remember my father's voice calling to me from the deep places, telling me to come back when the time is right." Father O'Malley's blood turned cold. "What else do you remember?" "I remember that you hear his voice too, Father. Every night when you kneel beside your bed to pray. He calls to you just as he calls to us. He knows your name." The priest stood up quickly, his knees shaking. Around him, the other boys had formed a perfect circle, their green eyes fixed on his face. They were smiling, but their smiles were gentle and sad, as if they pitied him for something he did not yet understand. "I must go," Father O'Malley said, and his voice sounded strange in his own ears. Moira walked him to the door, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the bog water red as blood. The mist was rising again, thick and white as milk. "Father," Moira said as he prepared to leave, "he is not evil, you know. Thomas, he loves us. He has always loved us. Long before we were born, before our mothers were born, before this village existed. His love is patient and deep as the bog itself. But what does he want?" Father O'Malley asked. "What is the purpose of all this?" Moira smiled, and for a moment, she looked like the girl she had been before her wedding, before the children, before the weight of years had settled on her shoulders. "He wants what any father wants, Father. He wants his family to be together. All of us, always, in the place where love never dies and children never leave their parents' side." The priest walked away from the cottage as darkness fell over Ballinakil. Behind him, He could hear the sound of children's voices singing a lullaby in a language he did not recognize. The words seemed to follow him down the muddy path, wrapping around him like invisible arms, pulling him back toward the cottage and the family that should not exist. That night, as he knelt beside his bed to pray, Father O'Malley heard the voice that Cian had spoken of. It came from beneath the floorboards of his small room, from the spaces between his heartbeats, from the dark water that ran beneath all things. It spoke his name with infinite patience and love, and it asked him the question he had been dreading for 5 long years. When would he finally come home? The year 1897 brought hunger back to County Mayo like an old wound opening fresh. The potato blight had returned with the autumn rains, turning the fields black and filling the air with the smell of rot. In the village of Ballinakil, families counted every grain of barley, every drop of milk, every crust of bread. Children grew thin and hollow-eyed, and old women crossed themselves when they passed the withered gardens. But the Carrowmoor cottage at the edge of the bog remained untouched by want. The 12 boys had grown into young men, the oldest now approaching his 50th year despite having been born barely 4 decades past. They worked the bog with hands that never tired, cutting peat that burned longer and warmer than any other fuel in the village. Their mother's garden bloomed green and full when others failed, heavy with vegetables that grew too large and too fast under the weak Irish sun. Timothy, the boy who had once been called Cian, stood 6 feet tall with shoulders broad as a dock worker's. His hair had darkened from copper to the color of old blood, but his eyes remained that impossible shade of deep water green. He was the spokesman for his brothers now, the one who dealt with the village when dealing was necessary. The other 11 followed him like shadows, speaking only when spoken to, moving with that same strange coordination they had shown as children. Father O'Malley was 73 years old and felt every day of it in his bones. His hair had gone white as winter, and his hands shook when he lifted the chalice during Mass. The confessional had become his refuge and his torment, a small dark box where the sins of Ballinakil came to die in whispered words. But lately, he found himself unable to speak the words of absolution. How could he forgive the small hungers and petty jealousies of his parishioners when his own soul carried a weight that bent his back like a yoke? On this particular Sunday, as the rain drummed against the chapel windows and the congregation shivered in their thin coats, Timothy Carrowmoor came to confession for the first time in his life. The young man had to fold himself into the cramped space, his knees touching the wooden screen that separated penitent from priest. Through the carved holes, Father O'Malley could see those green eyes, patient and knowing, waiting in the darkness. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," Timothy said, and his voice was deep as water moving over stone. "Though I am not certain what my sins might be, or if they are truly mine to confess." The priest's throat felt dry as dust. "Tell me what troubles your conscience, my son." "I remember things, Father. Things that happened before I was born. I remember my father's voice calling to us from the deep places, promising us a home beneath the black water where we would never know hunger or cold or loss. I remember the taste of bog water on my tongue, the weight of stone above my head, the feeling of being very old and very patient and very much in love." Father O'Malley gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned white. "These are dreams, Timothy. Nothing more." "Are they?" The young man leaned closer to the screen, and his breath misted in the cold air. "Then why do all my brothers dream the same dreams? Why do we speak the same words in our sleep, words in a language our mothers never taught us? Why do the village children run when they see us coming, as if they know we are not quite what we appear to be?" The priest closed his eyes, but that only made the young man's voice seem closer, more intimate. "You have lived a good life, Timothy. You and your brothers work hard. You care for your mothers. You trouble no one. But we are not supposed to exist, are we, Father?" Timothy's voice was gentle, almost kind. "We are the children of man who is never born, who lives beneath the bog in places that have no names. We are the fruit of vows spoken to empty air, the answers to prayers that should never have been prayed." Through the confessional screen, Father O'Malley could see Timothy's hand resting on his knee. The fingers were long and pale, and for just a moment, the priest could swear he saw water dripping from them, dark bog water that pooled on the wooden floor and disappeared between the cracks. "I have watched you, Father," Timothy continued, his voice never rising above a whisper. "I have seen how your hands shake when you hold the communion wine, how you start at shadows, how you walk home from our cottage as if something is chasing you. He calls to you too, doesn't he? Our Father. He has been calling to you for 50 years, and you have been pretending not to hear." "I don't know what you mean," Father O'Malley said, but the words sounded false even to his own ears. "When you were a young priest, fresh from seminary, full of faith and certainty, you heard a voice in the bog one night. You were walking home from sick call, and the mist was thick, and you lost your way. You knelt by the water's edge to pray for guidance, and a voice spoke to you from beneath the surface. It knew your name. It knew your heart. It offered you things that a priest should never want." The old man's breath came in short, painful gasps. The memory was there, buried deep but never forgotten. A voice like honey in drowning, promising him love that would last forever, a family that would never leave him, children who would call him father in truth as well as title. "You said no," Timothy whispered, "but you never forgot. And when the Carrowmoor sisters came to you, when they asked you to perform weddings to a groom who was not there, you said yes because part of you wanted to see what would happen. Part of you wanted to know if the voice had been real." "Stop," Father O'Malley said, but his voice was barely audible. "Now you know," Timothy said. "We are real, Father. All 12 of us. We are the proof that the voice beneath the bog was not madness or dream. We are the children of Thomas Blackwater, who loves so deeply and so patiently that death cannot touch him. And we are your children too, in a way, because you were the one who made our existence possible." The priest opened his eyes and looked through the screen at the young man who should not exist. Timothy's face was calm, almost serene, but there was something else there, something that looked like pity. "What do you want from me?" Father O'Malley asked. "Nothing that you do not want to give," Timothy replied. "My father is patient. He has waited this long. He can wait longer. But the time is coming, Father, when the choice will be made for you. When the bog rises and the deep places open, when the children of Ballinakil are called home to the place where love never dies." Timothy stood up, unfolding himself from the confessional like a shadow, growing long at sunset. "Thank you for listening, Father. It has been good to speak these things aloud, even if no absolution can be given for sins that were decided before the world was young." He left the confessional, and Father O'Malley sat alone in the darkness, listening to the rain against the windows and the sound of his own heart beating too fast in his chest. Outside, he could hear the congregation singing a hymn, their voices thin and desperate with hunger. But underneath their singing, barely audible but definitely there, was another sound. The sound of something large and patient breathing beneath the chapel floor, beneath the village, beneath the bog that surrounded them all. That night, as Father O'Malley knelt beside his narrow bed to pray, he found that the words would not come. Instead, he listened to the voice that had been calling to him for 50 years, the voice that promised him rest and family and love without end. The voice that knew his name and his heart and the weight of all his unconfessed sins. For the first time in half a century, he found himself wanting to answer. Easter Sunday of 1899 dawned gray and cold over Ballinakil, with mist rising from the bog like the breath of sleeping giants. Father O'Malley stood at his bedroom window, watching the sun struggle through the clouds, and felt something final settling in his chest. He was 75 now, bent with age and the weight of 50 years of unspoken truth. His hands shook as he dressed for what he somehow knew would be his last Easter Mass. The chapel bells had not rung that morning. When young Patrick Murphy went to pull the ropes, he found them severed clean through, as if cut by invisible hands. The metal bells hung silent in their tower, and the village woke to a silence that felt heavy with waiting. Father O'Malley walked slowly to the chapel, his prayer book clutched against his chest. The building looked the same as it had for 100 years, built from local stone that had turned gray with weather and time. But something was different. The air around it shimmered slightly, like heat waves on a summer day, though the morning was cool. And there was a sound, barely audible, like whispers coming from beneath the foundation stones. Inside, the congregation was smaller than usual. Many families had left Ballinakil over the years, driven away by hunger or fear or the strange feeling that the village itself was somehow wrong. Those who remained sat in their pews with heads bowed, as if afraid to look too closely at the altar or the shadows that seemed to move in the corners of their vision. The Carrowmoor family occupied the front pew, as they always had. Siobhan sat between her two sisters, her auburn hair now streaked with white despite her 29 years. Bridget looked like a woman made of mist, pale and insubstantial, her eyes focused on something beyond the chapel walls. Moira had aged the most, her face lined with sorrow and her hands folded over a belly that had never carried children, though she had been married longer than either of her sisters. Behind them sat the 12 sons, no longer boys but grown men with the same impossible green eyes and copper hair. They were arranged by age, oldest to youngest, their faces serene and patient, as if they were waiting for something they had been expecting all their lives. Father O'Malley began the Easter service, his voice echoing strangely in the stone chapel. The words felt hollow in his mouth, empty of the comfort they had once carried. As he spoke of resurrection and eternal life, he found himself thinking of other kinds of life, older kinds that existed in the spaces between heartbeats and in the dark water beneath the bog. It was during the communion that it began. The priest had just blessed the bread and wine when the first tongue of flame appeared, flickering to life in the air above the altar without any earthly source. It danced there for a moment, beautiful and terrible, casting shadows that moved like living things across the chapel walls. Then another flame joined it, and another, until the air itself seemed to be burning with cold fire that gave no heat. The congregation sat frozen in their pews, too frightened to move or speak. But the Carrowmoor family rose as one. Their faces turned upward to the flames with expressions of joy, so pure it broke Father O'Malley's heart to see it. "It is time," Timothy said, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel despite speaking barely above a whisper. "Our Father calls us home." The flames began to spread, but they consumed nothing. They passed through wood and stone and flesh without burning, leaving everything untouched yet somehow transformed. Where the fire passed, the air grew thick and sweet, like the smell of water deep underground. The chapel walls seemed to become transparent, revealing glimpses of other places, vast caverns filled with gentle light and the sound of children playing in pools that reflected no sky. One by one, the 12 sons stood and walked toward the altar. They moved with the same coordination they had shown all their lives, their footsteps perfectly synchronized, their breathing perfectly matched. As they reached the flames, each one turned to look back at their mothers with faces full of love and gratitude, and something that might have been goodbye. Then they stepped into the fire and disappeared, not burning, but simply fading away like mist in morning sunlight. Bridget rose next, her face radiant with happiness. She walked to where her sons had vanished and held out her arms, as if embracing an invisible lover. "Thomas," she whispered, and her voice was full of 50 years of longing. "I'm coming home." The flames embraced her gently, and she was gone. Moira followed, then Siobhan, each woman walking calmly into the fire that consumed nothing and everything. But as Siobhan reached the altar, she stopped and turned to look at Father O'Malley. Her eyes, which had been distant for so many years, were suddenly clear and focused and full of terrible compassion. "You don't have to stay, Father," she said. "He would welcome you. He has always loved you, just as he loved us. You could come home too." The priest stood at the communion rail, the blessed wine still in his hands, and felt the weight of 50 years of choice pressing down on him. The voice beneath the bog called to him now, not whispering but singing, promising him rest and family and love without end. All he had to do was take one step forward. One step into the flames that burned with no heat and consumed with no pain. For a moment, he almost did it. For a moment, the loneliness of his life seemed unbearable, and the promise of belonging somewhere, to someone, was almost too strong to resist. But then he looked at his congregation, at the men and women and children who sat frozen in their pews, and he knew he could not abandon them. Not yet. Not while they still needed someone to stand between them and the darkness that lived beneath their world. No, he said quietly. Not today. Siobhan nodded, as if she had expected his answer. He will wait, she said. He is very patient. But the choice will come again. She stepped into the flames and vanished, leaving Father O'Malley alone at the altar as the fire began to fade. The last thing he saw before the flames died completely was a pair of green eyes looking back at him from somewhere far away, full of understanding and infinite sadness. When it was over, the chapel looked exactly as it had before. The altar was unmarked, the communion wine still pure in its chalice. But the silence was different now, emptier, as if something essential had been taken from the world. The congregation sat motionless for a long moment, then rose and filed out without speaking, their faces blank with shock and something that might have been relief. Father O'Malley stood alone in the empty chapel until evening fell. When he finally walked to the Carrowmoor cottage, he found it dark and cold, its rooms empty of everything except memory and loss. The furniture was gone, the clothes, the children's toys, everything that had made it a home. Only the stones remained, and the silence, and the feeling that something important had ended. In the days that followed, searchers found 12 fresh graves in the old cemetery, their headstones blank and their earth settled, as if they had been there for decades. The parish records had turned to ash in the vestry, though no fire had touched them. The wedding registry was gone completely, as if it had never existed at all. Only one witness remained to what had happened that Easter morning. Mrs. Connor from the village edge claimed she saw 12 young men walking across the bog at sunrise, their figures growing fainter with each step until they disappeared into the morning mist. She said they were singing as they walked, a lullaby in a language she didn't recognize, and that the sound of it made her weep for reasons she couldn't understand. Years passed, and the story of the Carrowmoor family became legend, then myth, then half-remembered whisper. New families moved to Ballinakil, people who had never known the sisters or their impossible sons. The cottage fell into ruins, its stones scattered by wind and weather. The chapel was rebuilt, its walls clean of shadows, and its silence ordinary once more. But sometimes, on Easter mornings when the mist rises thick from the bog, people say they can hear children's laughter carried on the wind, and the voices of women singing lullabies to sons who will never grow old or leave their mother's side. And in the deep places beneath the bog, in the stone chambers where love becomes eternal, a patient voice still calls to those who listen, promising them home.